How do we define modern SMT? This is a question that has been nagging at me recently since it feels like modern SMT is in a bit of an undefined yet transitory state. When we look back at the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s SMT games, we have a clear idea of what they were and what defined that generation, at least to some extent. The 90s were the experimental, political, and provocative era of SMT, where the games felt edgy for the sake of being thought-provoking and unique. The notion of a contemporary setting rather than a Tolkien fantasy was a novel concept when SMT1 first released, and the game was unafraid to be confrontational with Japanese politics and culture in a way that has aged remarkably well. And then came the much-beloved golden age of Megaten, the 2000s, where better technology both in display and in development, combined with experience and a drive to make really special games that pushed boundaries, birthed cult classic after cult classic. Most of my personal favorites are from this period, like Nocturne and Digital Devil Saga. And this new mindset of refining and redefining previously established norms eventually gave rise to Neo Persona, the long-awaited hit that Atlus had wanted and which saved the company from oblivion. And then came the 2010s, often called the 3DS era because most of the games were on the 3DS, beginning with two of the most acclaimed games in that franchise, Devil Survivor and Strange Journey. This era was a needed step back to re-evaluate what needed to happen moving forwards. While we all love the Golden Age games before Persona, they were also flops commercially, eventually resulting in Atlus being absorbed into the Index company, which was later itself bought and merged into Sega. The reason for this shift was because Kazuma Kanako-sensei had suggested putting a mainline SMT game on the same console as Pokemon, and with that established, Atlus rolled with the simpler graphics and limited cartridge space to try and continue the trend of making cult classic games, building up their brand recognition beyond Trauma Center on the handheld, and learn from what had worked to help break into a wider appeal. Devil Survivor 2 is the most obvious example since it adds a social sim element akin to Persona and was quite successful for what it offered. It was a buffer era with promises of greatness looming on the horizon, while Atlus consolidated profit and eased some behind-the-scenes drama from their merger, before coming back to consoles with a bang with Persona 5. My and many others' first SMT game period. A commercial darling brimming of style and oozing personality, P5 is basically everything that Atlus needed it to be as a gateway title into their back catalog. Impressive graphics and being on a main console made it a lot more approachable, even for people who had never played an Atlus game before, and mixing and merging elements from both Persona and SMT meant that it could serve as a transition to and from each series without it feeling like a jarring shift. Persona 5 set the bar high, and with the release of SMT5 on the horizon and the 3DS being phased out for the Switch, which SMT5 would also be an exclusive for, it felt like Atlus had entered a new console age, just in time for the 2020s. And instead, the 2020s just ended with a bit of a whimper. The next game after Persona was SMT Strange Journey, released to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the franchise for the 3DS, now with voice acting, and it, along with the announcement that SMT5 was being worked on, was the only bit of news for mainline for years. Meanwhile, on the Persona end came the new dancing games. While P4 Dancing had a following for what it was, and Atlus had long expressed a desire for P3 Dancing, this duology was not well received, and funnily enough, had the fandom divided on which was the worst of the two. And then came Persona Q2, a repeat/sequel of Persona Q, but now with the Persona 5 cast added, alongside the Persona 3 and 4 cast, and it was released extremely late into the 3DS's lifespan. Finally, Atlus ended off the generation with Persona 5 Royal, a re-release of Persona 5, following the tradition of Fez and Golden, now with an extra semester. While Royal is beloved for smoothing out some of the fumbles in Persona 5, a lot of people, myself included, felt like it was too soon for a re-release when a lot of us were instead more looking forward to SMT5, which had gone radio silent post-announcement, beyond a confirmation that it hadn't been cancelled, or else had wanted Persona 6 or some other major release. In hindsight, this showed that the transition back to console had been somewhat rough for Atlus, who had at this point in time gotten used to making smaller scale projects. However, when the 2020s finally began, there were signs for optimism. Shin Megami Tensei 5 finally got a release date, and an HD port for Nocturne was announced to be released a few months before. Arguably even better was that both of these releases had their Japanese and worldwide in close proximity, making it the new standard for Atlus. Once these games were released, however, my optimism turned to pessimism. Nocturne was released to a lukewarm reception as it did not have selectable skill inheritance and was littered with many bugs that eventually warranted a patch to see these issues resolved. And then the long-awaited SMT 5, which despite being announced for the 25th anniversary, was released in an incomplete state, with plot being a charitable description for the scarce bits of story present, and containing none of the improvements that Atlus games had become known for in the near decade since the last SMT game. The UI was basic, combat had taken a massive hit, with level now being the determining factor for damage at the expense of all other variables. Buffs and debuffs had been nerfed to be non-factors, and the open world was just a sort of meh attempt. Not a terrible first attempt, but nothing to really praise as anything but. It is at this point where I suppose I should clarify that while I've been going largely by decade, these eras aren't actually defined so neatly as such. The golden era didn't really begin until 2002 with SMT9, and before that, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment, which I consider to be the finale of the 90s era, but like Innocent Sin before it is a transition between the 90s and 2000s. Meanwhile, the first game to begin the 3DS era was actually released in 2009. All that is to say that this part of history, the early 2020s, were a continuation of the late 2010s in a sense. The growing pains of Atlus transitioning their library and output back to consoles, and experiencing the pains that came from that shift. Slow development time and products that lacked in quality when compared to what had come before. And this was especially the case with Atlus's next major work, Soul Hackers 2. A game that tries to carry itself off of the branding of a beloved cult classic game, but which feels like it didn't really understand that game. Soul Hackers is the story of a group of hackers stumbling upon a conspiracy by the Phantom Society, an allegory for governmental corruption in collaboration with immoral corporate exploitation, harvesting the souls of people desperate to escape from their horrible lives through an escapist utopia that turns into a personalized nightmare for those unfortunate enough to be trapped by their inner demons, which then manifests as literal demons. My gripes of the execution aside, Soul Hackers is a game that feels relevant today because it feels like we live in the world prophesized by Soul Hackers. One of state-sanctioned greed leading to the widespread misery of the masses who seek any sort of escape from a seemingly inescapable system that uses technology to dehumanize and keep shackled by a reliance upon the systems controlled by the Phantom Society. The Phantom Society in Soul Hackers 2, by contrast, is a generic chaos faction, when the society had more in common with the lawful messiahs of SMT2 in both principle and practice. It is even said by Madame Ginkgo in Soul Hackers that the Phantom Society is not motivated by ideals like the forces of chaos are, but rather by control, making it very obvious that Atlus did not want the Phantom Society to be mistaken as anything but an evil organization. One where the demonic control of people through greed or through controlling what they need to live as a part of society serves as the central thesis and the central critique for a reliance upon technology. This is the most obvious of many examples of a blatant dissonance between Devil Summoner Soul Hackers and Soul Hackers 2. Next to soul hacking being changed from the method of breaking a person's mental fortitude and making their soul vulnerable to being a fancy technique to bring back the dead. Just some of the major examples that showcase that Soul Hackers 2 completely missed the point of the game it's trying to curry brand recognition from. And that is to say nothing of its identity crisis beyond as an awkward mixture of classic Persona and Strange Journey with a ridiculously quippy script and the theme being about interpersonal communication instead of any of the returning ideas entertained only to be shoved aside. Then of course came more Persona milking in the ports of Persona 3, 4, Arena Ultimax, and 5 on modern platforms to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Persona, followed by Persona 5 Tactica and Persona 3 Reload, one of the most requested Persona games ever, and yet a game pretty divisive on whether it is the definitive edition, especially as the answer, the canon epilogue campaign, was locked behind an expansion pass. When all of these lackluster showings are put together, I genuinely felt like hope for a great SMT game was asking for too much. Maybe it would have been melodramatic to call it a dark age, but the constant dearth of quality, repeated trend chasing to what was popular or requested versus what had made previous games so unique and beloved, had me feeling like modern SMT was missing everything that had made it special. Which is why when I saw that SMT 5, which I repeat is my least favorite game in the franchise, of all the potential SMT games that could have gotten a re-release, I went in with very little hope that it would be good. Yet, 5 Vengeance proved me wrong and left me with a lot of optimism. It is the best SMT game in years. Now that said, the canon of Vengeance is not perfect by any stretch. The Chaos ending feels a bit tacked on as there is no Chaos route leading up to it. The setting is still underwhelming, and while the middle is exceptional, the beginning and ending, largely by virtue of needing to conform to the pacing of the canon of creation, are far more haphazard in their pacing and writing. But still, this game genuinely feels like it understands what makes SMT so great and unique. It speaks to a theme and presents contrasting views that, while not necessarily mutually exclusive, are in a conflict of ideals, and leaves it to the player to decide what is right and dwell on if it really was or if the alternative was the better option. To call something modern is to say that it is a product of today, be that in graphics, hardware, or as a commentary on subject matter. And because of that, what is modern is a fluid, ever-changing conceptualization of our modern world and the standards of things like video games made on or for the current generation of consoles. What was modern just 2 years ago is no longer the modern of 2025. The canon of Vengeance makes me feel like perhaps the transitioning pains of the past decade are finally beginning to subside and make way to the potential to make something spectacular. Just a year ago, I wouldn't have been very excited for SMT 6, but now I am genuinely invested and excited for that possibility. An upcoming project with a registered domain name, and with the benefit of now having pre-made demon models and the experience of working in a high-quality 3D engine. The next likely thing to come out of Team Maniacs, and which should be the priority if they are serious about showing that this team can make great SMT games to rival the standard set by the Golden Age games. To end this video off, I'd like to ask my viewers what their takeaway from the canon of Vengeance was, and if, like me, you think that this is a good omen for the future of the franchise, and perhaps expand upon that down in the comments section below. What would you like to see from Atlus in the new era, especially with the Switch 2 on the horizon? What would you like to see from SMT 6 specifically? Only time will tell if my prediction of a later this year release or at least announcement date is accurate, but I'd like to start this year off with something positive, and right now I feel really good about this possibility. I genuinely feel like we are transitioning from one era of SMT to a new, better era. One where good games are made and the stories are insightful and thought-provoking and the subject matter understands what came before it and isn't wrapped up in trend chasing what the market says sells, especially when it goes against what made people love SMT in the first place. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments section. Like and subscribe if you liked the video and want to see more. A video I personally recommend is here, and one that the algorithm recommends is on the other side. Until next time, have a fantastic week.